Welcome to TutorialsArena, your ultimate destination for mastering web development. Are you just starting your journey with React, or perhaps looking to solidify your foundational knowledge? Well, you're in the right place. We've crafted 100 essential React beginner MCQs designed to test your understanding and boost your confidence. Stay tuned until the end for a special announcement. Let's dive right in. Starting with question 1. Who developed React? The options are: Option A, Google. Option B, Facebook. Option C, Microsoft. Option D, Twitter. The correct answer is Option B, Facebook. Moving on to the next question. Question 2. When was React first released? The options are: Option A, 2011. Option B, 2013. Option C, 2015. Option D, 2017. The correct answer is Option B, 2013. Moving on to the next question. Question 3. What is React primarily used for? The options are: Option A, building databases. Option B, building user interfaces. Option C, server-side programming. Option D, data analysis. The correct answer is Option B, building user interfaces. Moving on to the next question. Question 4. Is React a library or a framework? The options are: Option A, framework. Option B, library. Option C, both. Option D, neither. The correct answer is Option B, library. Moving on to the next question. Question 5. What is JSX in React? The options are: Option A, a new programming language. Option B, JavaScript XML syntax extension. Option C, a database query language. Option D, a styling framework. The correct answer is Option B, JavaScript XML syntax extension. Moving on to the next question. Question 6. Can web browsers directly understand and run JSX? The options are: Option A, yes. Option B, no. Option C, only in some browsers. Option D, depends on the server. The correct answer is Option B, no. Moving on to the next question. Question 7. What tool is commonly used to transpile JSX into regular JavaScript? The options are: Option A, Webpack. Option B, Babel. Option C, ESLint. Option D, Redux. The correct answer is Option B, Babel. Moving on to the next question. Question 8. What is the core building block of a React application? The options are: Option A, modules. Option B, components. Option C, templates. Option D, functions. The correct answer is Option B, components. Moving on to the next question. Question 9. How do you create a functional component in React? The options are: Option A, using the class keyword. Option B, using a regular JavaScript function. Option C, using the component keyword. Option D, using the create class method. The correct answer is Option B, using a regular JavaScript function. Moving on to the next question. Question 10. How do you create a class component in React? The options are: Option A, using a regular JavaScript function. Option B, using the class keyword. Option C, using the component keyword. Option D, using the create function method. The correct answer is Option B, using the class keyword. Moving on to the next question. Question 11. What is the purpose of the render method in a class component? The options are: Option A, to update the component's state. Option B, to fetch data. Option C, to define the component's UI. Option D, to handle events. The correct answer is Option C, to define the component's UI. Moving on to the next question. Question 12. What is the virtual DOM in React? The options are: Option A, a direct representation of the DOM. Option B, a copy of the DOM kept in memory. Option C, a database of DOM elements. Option D, a server-side rendering technique. The correct answer is Option B, a copy of the DOM kept in memory. Moving on to the next question. Question 13. Why does React use the virtual DOM? The options are: Option A, to directly manipulate the DOM. Option B, for faster updates to the UI. Option C, to store component data. Option D, to handle routing. The correct answer is option B, for faster updates to the UI. Moving on to the next question. Question 14. What is the main way to pass data from a parent to a child component? The options are option A, state. Option B, props. Option C, context API. Option D, Redux. The correct answer is option B, props. Moving on to the next question. Question 15. Are props mutable or immutable in the child component? The options are option A, mutable. Option B, immutable. Option C, depends on the data type. Option D, only mutable for class components. The correct answer is option B, immutable. Moving on to the next question. Question 16. What is the purpose of state in a React component? The options are option A, to pass data to parent components. Option B, to store data that can change over time. Option C, to define static content. Option D, to handle external API calls. The correct answer is option B, to store data that can change over time. Moving on to the next question. Question 17. How do you update the state in a class component? The options are option A, by directly modifying this.state. Option B, using the this.setState method. Option C, using the updateState method. Option D, by modifying the virtual DOM. The correct answer is option B, using the this.setState method. Moving on to the next question. Question 18. How do you update the state in a functional component using hooks? The options are option A, using this.setState. Option B, using the useState hook setter function. Option C, by directly modifying the state variable. Option D, using the updateState hook. The correct answer is option B, using the useState hook setter function. Moving on to the next question. Question 19. What is the initial value of state in a functional component using useState? The options are option A, null. Option B, undefined. Option C, the value passed to useState. Option D, an empty object. The correct answer is option C, the value passed to useState. Moving on to the next question. Question 20. How do you handle events in React elements? The options are option A, using lowercase HTML event names. Option B, using camelcase event names. Option C, using hyphenated event names. Option D, using event listener functions. The correct answer is option B, using camelcase event names. Moving on to the next question. Question 21. What is a synthetic event in React? The options are option A, a native browser event. Option B, a cross-browser wrapper around native events. Option C, a custom event created by the user. Option D, an error handling event. The correct answer is option B, a cross-browser wrapper around native events. Moving on to the next question. Question 22. How do you prevent the default behavior of an event in React? The options are option A, event.stop. Option B, event.prevent default. Option C, event.cancel event. Option D, event.stop propagation. The correct answer is option B, event.prevent default. Moving on to the next question. Question 23. What is the purpose of the key prop when rendering lists of elements? The options are option A, to provide styling. Option B, to uniquely identify elements in a list. Option C, to specify the order of elements. Option D, to hide elements. The correct answer is option B, to uniquely identify elements in a list. Moving on to the next question. Question 24. Why are keys important when rendering lists? The options are option A, for styling purposes. Option B, for performance optimization and correct rendering. Option C, to make the list read only. Option D, to add event listeners. The correct answer is option B, for performance optimization and correct rendering. Moving on to the next question. Question 25. Which hook is used to add state to functional components? The options are option A, useEffect. Option B, useContext. Option C, useState. Option D, useReducer. The correct answer is option C, useState. That's a quarter of the way through. How are you doing so far? If you're finding this helpful, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to stay updated with more amazing tutorials from TutorialsArena. Let's continue our React journey. Moving on to the next question. Question 26. Which hook is used to perform side effects in functional components? The options are option A, useState, option B, useReducer, option C, useContext, option D, useEffect. The correct answer is option D, useEffect. Moving on to the next question. Question 27. What does the dependency array in useEffect control? The options are option A, the initial state, option B, the props passed to the component, option C, when the effect should rerun, option D, the return value of the effect. The correct answer is option C, when the effect should rerun. Moving on to the next question. Question 28. What happens if the dependency array in useEffect is empty? The options are option A, the effect runs on every render, option B, the effect runs only on the initial render, option C, the effect never runs, option D, the component crashes. The correct answer is option B, the effect runs only on the initial render. Moving on to the next question. Question 29. What is the purpose of the cleanup function returned by useEffect? The options are option A, to perform an action before the effect runs, option B, to clean up resources when the component unmounts or dependencies change, option C, to update the component state, option D, to log errors. The correct answer is option B, to clean up resources when the component unmounts or dependencies change. Moving on to the next question. Question 30. What is Context API in React used for? The options are option A, state management in class components, option B, passing data through the component tree without prop drilling, option C, handling form submissions, option D, creating animations. The correct answer is option B, passing data through the component tree without prop drilling. Moving on to the next question. Question 31. What is prop drilling? The options are option A, passing data down through multiple nested components, option B, passing data up to parent components, option C, accessing the DOM directly, option D, styling components with props. The correct answer is option A, passing data down through multiple nested components. Moving on to the next question. Question 32. What is the primary benefit of using Context API? The options are option A, improved performance, option B, easier state management for simple applications, option C, avoiding prop drilling, option D, server-side rendering. The correct answer is option C, avoiding prop drilling. Moving on to the next question. Question 33. What is a higher order component, or HOC? The options are option A, a component that renders another component, option B, a function that takes a component and returns a new component, option C, a component that handles state logically, option D, a component used for routing. The correct answer is option B, a function that takes a component and returns a new component. Moving on to the next question. Question 34. What is the purpose of HOCs? The options are option A, to manage component state, option B, to reuse component logic, option C, to handle styling, option D, to define component structure. The correct answer is option B, to reuse component logic. Moving on to the next question. Question 35. What is the difference between a controlled and uncontrolled component? The options are option A, controlled components manage their own state, uncontrolled components rely on the DOM. Option B, uncontrolled components manage their own state, controlled components rely on the DOM. Option C, controlled components use props, uncontrolled components use state. Option D, there is no difference. The correct answer is option A, controlled components manage their own state, uncontrolled components rely on the DOM. Moving on to the next question. Question 36. In a controlled component, where is the form data typically stored? The options are option A, in the DOM, option B, in the component state, option C, in local storage, option D, in the parent component state? The correct answer is option B, in the component state. Moving on to the next question. Question 37. How do you handle form input changes in a controlled component? The options are option A, by directly modifying the DOM. Option B, using an onChange event handler that updates state. Option C, using an onSubmit event handler. Option D, by accessing the input value with a ref. The correct answer is option B, using an onChange event handler that updates state. Moving on to the next question. Question 38. What is the purpose of ReactDOM.render? The options are option A, to define a component's UI. Option B, to update the component state. Option C, to render a React element into the DOM. Option D, to handle events. The correct answer is option C, to render a React element into the DOM. Moving on to the next question. Question 39. What is the entry point of a typical React application? The options are option A, index.html. Option B, app.js. Option C, index.js. Option D, package.json. The correct answer is option C, index.js. Moving on to the next question. Question 40. What command is used to create a new React application using Create React App? The options are option A, npm, Create React App My App. Option B, Create React App My App. Option C, npx Create React App My App. Option D, yarn new React App My App. The correct answer is option C, npx Create React App My App. Moving on to the next question. Question 41. What is the default port where a Create React App development server runs? The options are option A, 5000. Option B, 8080. Option C, 3000. Option D, 8000. The correct answer is option C, 3000. Moving on to the next question. Question 42. What is the purpose of the public folder in a Create React app? The options are option A, to store source code. Option B, to store static assets. Option C, to store component files. Option D, to store build output. The correct answer is option B, to store static assets. Moving on to the next question. Question 43. What is the purpose of the src folder in a Create React app? The options are option A, to store static assets. Option B, to store build output. Option C, to store the application source code. Option D, to store external libraries. The correct answer is option C, to store the application source code. Moving on to the next question. Question 44. What is the output of the npm build or yarn build command in Create React App? The options are option A, the source code. Option B, the development server. Option C, the production build of the application. Option D, the test files. The correct answer is option C, the production build of the application. Moving on to the next question. Question 45. What is the purpose of the package.json file? The options are option A, to store application data. Option B, to define the application's dependencies and scripts. Option C, to configure the database. Option D, to manage user authentication. The correct answer is option B, to define the application's dependencies and scripts. Moving on to the next question. Question 46. What is a single-page application or SPA? The options are option A, an application with only one HTML file. Option B, an application with multiple HTML files. Option C, an application that requires a server for every page load. Option D, an application that uses only JavaScript. The correct answer is option A, an application with only one HTML file. Moving on to the next question. Question 47. How does React typically enable building SPAs? The options are option A, by using multiple HTML files. Option B, by dynamically updating the content of a single HTML page. Option C, by relying on server-side rendering. Option D, by using different URLs for each view. The correct answer is option B, by dynamically updating the content of a single HTML page. Moving on to the next question. Question 48. What is client-side rendering or CSR in React? The options are: Option A, rendering the UI on the server. Option B, rendering the UI in the user's browser. Option C, rendering the UI in the database. Option D, rendering the UI during the build process. The correct answer is Option B, rendering the UI in the user's browser. Moving on to the next question. Question 49. What is server-side rendering or SSR in React? The options are: Option A, rendering the UI in the user's browser. Option B, rendering the UI on the server. Option C, rendering the UI during the build process. Option D, rendering the UI in the database. The correct answer is Option B, rendering the UI on the server. Moving on to the next question. Question 50. What is the main benefit of SSR for React applications? The options are: Option A, faster initial page load and better SEO. Option B, improved client-side performance. Option C, reduced server load. Option D, simplified development process. The correct answer is Option A, faster initial page load and better SEO. Halfway there. You're doing great. If you're enjoying these questions and learning something new, please show your support by subscribing to TutorialsArena and hitting that like button. It truly helps us create more valuable content for you. Let's keep the momentum going. Moving on to the next question. Question 51. What are React fragments? The options are: Option A, a way to group multiple elements without adding an extra DOM node. Option B, a way to define reusable components. Option C, a method for handling events. Option D, a type of state management. The correct answer is Option A, a way to group multiple elements without adding an extra DOM node. Moving on to the next question. Question 52. Why would you use a React fragment? The options are: Option A, to add extra styling to elements. Option B, when you need to return multiple elements from a component's render or return. Option C, to improve component performance. Option D, to access the DOM directly. The correct answer is Option B, when you need to return multiple elements from a component's render or return. Moving on to the next question. Question 53. What is the shorthand syntax for React fragments? The options are: Option A, empty angle brackets or empty tags. Option B, fragment tag. Option C, React.fragment tag. Option D, self-closing fragment tag. The correct answer is Option A, empty angle brackets or empty tags. Moving on to the next question. Question 54. What is the purpose of prop types in React? The options are: Option A, to define the initial state. Option B, to validate the props passed to a component. Option C, to handle asynchronous operations. Option D, to create reusable components. The correct answer is Option D, to validate the props passed to a component. Moving on to the next question. Question 55. When are prop types typically checked? The options are: Option A, at runtime in development mode. Option B, at compile time. Option C, only in production mode. Option D, when the component is unmounted. The correct answer is Option A, at runtime in development mode. Moving on to the next question. Question 56. What is the difference between state and props regarding who manages the data? The options are: Option A, state is managed by the parent component, props by the component itself. Option B, state is managed by the component itself, props by the parent component. Option C, both are managed by the parent component. Option D, both are managed by the component itself. The correct answer is Option B, state is managed by the component itself, props by the parent component. Moving on to the next question. Question 57. Can a child component directly modify the props it receives from a parent? The options are: Option A, yes. Option B, no. Option C, only if the prop is an object. Option D, only in class components. The correct answer is Option B, no. Moving on to the next question. Question 58. Can a component modify its own state? The options are: Option A, yes. Option B, no. Option C, only in functional components. Option D, only in class components. The correct answer is Option A, yes. Moving on to the next question. Question 59. What is the recommended way to pass functions from a parent to a child component? The options are Option A, as state. Option B, as props. Option C, using context API. Option D, directly call the function in the child. The correct answer is Option B, as props. Moving on to the next question. Question 60. How can a child component communicate with its parent component? The options are Option A, by directly modifying the parent's state. Option B, by calling a function passed as a prop. Option C, by using the ref attribute. Option D, by accessing the parent component directly. The correct answer is Option B, by calling a function passed as a prop. Moving on to the next question. Question 61. What is conditional rendering in React? The options are Option A, rendering components based on a condition. Option B, rendering components only once. Option C, rendering components in a loop. Option D, rendering components based on user input. The correct answer is Option A, rendering components based on a condition. Moving on to the next question. Question 62. Which of the following can be used for conditional rendering in JSX? The options are Option A, for loop. Option B, while loop. Option C, ternary operator. Option D, switch statement. The correct answer is Option C, ternary operator. Moving on to the next question. Question 63. What is the purpose of the logical and operator in conditional rendering? The options are Option A, to render an element if a condition is false. Option B, to render an element if a condition is true. Option C, to perform a logical OR operation. Option D, to define a fallback UI. The correct answer is Option B, to render an element if a condition is true. Moving on to the next question. Question 64. What is list rendering in React? The options are Option A, rendering a single element multiple times. Option B, rendering a collection of elements. Option C, styling a list of items. Option D, handling events on list items. The correct answer is Option B, rendering a collection of elements. Moving on to the next question. Question 65. Which array method is commonly used for list rendering in React? The options are Option A, for each method. Option B, map method. Option C, filter method. Option D, reduce method. The correct answer is Option B, map method. Moving on to the next question. Question 66. Where should the key prop be placed when rendering a list? The options are Option A, on the parent element of the list. Option B, on the list component itself. Option C, on each individual element in the list. Option D, on the data array. The correct answer is Option C, on each individual element in the list. Moving on to the next question. Question 67. What is the significance of the ref attribute in React? The options are Option A, to uniquely identify elements. Option B, to access DOM nodes or React elements directly. Option C, to define component props. Option D, to manage component state. The correct answer is Option B, to access DOM nodes or React elements directly. Moving on to the next question. Question 68. When should you typically use a ref? The options are Option A, for modifying the DOM directly when necessary. Option B, for managing component state. Option C, for passing data between components. Option D, for handling events. The correct answer is Option A, for modifying the DOM directly when necessary. Moving on to the next question. Question 69. What is the purpose of useRef hook? The options are Option A, to manage state in functional components. Option B, to perform side effects in functional components. Option C, to create mutable ref objects. Option D, to access context in functional components. The correct answer is Option C, to create mutable ref objects. Moving on to the next question. Question 70. What is the difference between useRef and useState? The options are Option A, useRef triggers re-renders, useState does not. Option B, useState triggers re-renders, useRef does not. Option C, useRef is for state management, useState is for DOM access. Option D. useState is for side effects, useRef is for state. The correct answer is Option B. useState triggers re-renders, useRef does not. Moving on to the next question. Question 71. What is the purpose of useContext hook? The options are Option A. To access state in functional components. Option B. To perform side effects in functional components. Option C. To consume a context. Option D. To create a new context. The correct answer is Option C. To consume a context. Moving on to the next question. Question 72. How does useContext help with prop drilling? The options are Option A. It eliminates the need for props. Option B. It allows direct access to context values without passing props down. Option C. It automatically passes props to all children. Option D. It provides a global state management solution. The correct answer is Option B. It allows direct access to context values without passing props down. Moving on to the next question. Question 73. What is the purpose of useReducer hook? The options are Option A. To manage simple state. Option B. To manage complex state logic in functional components. Option C. To perform side effects. Option D. To access context. The correct answer is Option B. To manage complex state logic in functional components. Moving on to the next question. Question 74. When might you prefer useReducer over useState? The options are Option A. For simple Boolean state. Option B. For state that involves multiple related subvalues or complex transitions. Option C. For fetching data from an API. Option D. For accessing the DOM directly. The correct answer is Option B. For state that involves multiple related subvalues or complex transitions. Moving on to the next question. Question 75. What are custom hooks? The options are Option A. Built-in React hooks. Option B. Hooks created by developers to reuse stateful logic. Option C. Hooks used for styling components. Option D. Hooks for handling routing. The correct answer is Option B. Hooks created by developers to reuse stateful logic. You're almost there. Just a few more questions to go. If you're finding this video helpful and want to continue improving your React skills, please consider subscribing to TutorialsArena and hitting the like button. Your support helps us create more content like this. Moving on to the next question. Question 76. What is the naming convention for custom hooks? The options are Option A. They must start with handle. Option B. They must start with use. Option C. They must start with custom. Option D. They can have any name. The correct answer is Option B. They must start with use. Moving on to the next question. Question 77. What is the benefit of creating custom hooks? The options are Option A. Improved performance. Option B. Reusing stateful logic across components. Option C. Simplified styling. Option D. Easier routing. The correct answer is Option B. Reusing stateful logic across components. Moving on to the next question. Question 78. What is the purpose of memoization in React? Example, React.memo, use memo, use callback. The options are Option A. To manage component state. Option B. To improve performance by preventing unnecessary re-renders. Option C. To handle asynchronous operations. Option D. To define component structure. The correct answer is Option B. To improve performance by preventing unnecessary re-renders. Moving on to the next question. Question 79. What does React.memo do? The options are Option A. Memoizes the result of a function. Option B. Memoizes a functional component to prevent re-renders if props haven't changed. Option C. Memoizes a callback function. Option D. Memoizes a state variable. The correct answer is Option B. Memoizes a functional component to prevent re-renders if props haven't changed. Moving on to the next question. Question 80. What does useMemo do? The options are Option A. Memoizes a functional component. Option B. Memoizes a value so it's only recalculated when dependencies change. Option C. memoizes a callback function. Option D, memoizes a state variable. The correct answer is option B, memoizes a value so it's only recalculated when dependencies change. Moving on to the next question. Question 81. What does useCallback do? The options are option A, memoizes a functional component. Option B, memoizes a value. Option C, memoizes a callback function so it's not recreated on every render if dependencies haven't changed. Option D, memoizes a state variable. The correct answer is option C, memoizes a callback function so it's not recreated on every render if dependencies haven't changed. Moving on to the next question. Question 82. When might you use useCallback? The options are option A, when passing a callback function as a prop to a memoized child component. Option B, for heavy computations. Option C, for managing component state. Option D, for accessing the DOM directly. The correct answer is option A, when passing a callback function as a prop to a memoized child component. Moving on to the next question. Question 83. What is the concept of lifting state up? The options are option A, moving state to a child component. Option B, moving state to a parent component. Option C, moving state to a separate file. Option D, moving state to a global store. The correct answer is option B, moving state to a parent component. Moving on to the next question. Question 84. Why would you lift state up? The options are option A, to make the state local to a component. Option B, to share state between sibling components. Option C, to improve styling. Option D, to reduce the number of components. The correct answer is option B, to share state between sibling components. Moving on to the next question. Question 85. What are the limitations of React? The options are option A, it is a full-blown framework. Option B, it is only a library and requires additional libraries for a complete solution. Option C, it is difficult to learn. Option D, it does not support server-side rendering. The correct answer is option B, it is only a library and requires additional libraries for a complete solution. Moving on to the next question. Question 86. What is the role of a bundler like Webpack in a React project? The options are option A, to manage component state. Option B, to transpile JSX. Option C, to combine and optimize project files for the browser. Option D, to handle routing. The correct answer is option C, to combine and optimize project files for the browser. Moving on to the next question. Question 87. What is the purpose of hot module replacement, HMR? The options are option A, to refresh the entire page on code changes. Option B, to update only the changed modules without a full page reload. Option C, to optimize the build process. Option D, to perform server-side rendering. The correct answer is option B, to update only the changed modules without a full page reload. Moving on to the next question. Question 88. What are React Dev Tools? The options are option A, a command line interface for React. Option B, a browser extension for debugging React applications. Option C, a library for creating React components. Option D, a tool for testing React applications. The correct answer is option B, a browser extension for debugging React applications. Moving on to the next question. Question 89. How can React DevTools help in debugging? The options are option A, by showing the component tree and their props and state. Option B, by automatically fixing errors. Option C, by generating test cases. Option D, by providing performance metrics. The correct answer is option A, by showing the component tree and their props and state. Moving on to the next question. Question 90. What is the concept of thinking in React? The options are option A, designing the UI using only CSS. Option B, breaking down the UI into a component hierarchy and managing data flow. Option C, writing all code in a single file. Option D, using a specific design pattern. The correct answer is option B, breaking down the UI into a component hierarchy and managing data flow. Moving on to the next question. Question 91. What is the unidirectional data flow in React? The options are option A, data flows only from parent to child components. Option B, data flows only from child to parent components. Option C, data can flow in any direction. Option D, data is managed globally. The correct answer is option A, data flows only from parent to child components. Moving on to the next question. Question 92. What is the benefit of unidirectional data flow? The options are: Option A, makes debugging easier and application predictable. Option B, improves performance. Option C, reduces the amount of code needed. Option D, enables direct DOM manipulation. The correct answer is option A, makes debugging easier and application predictable. Moving on to the next question. Question 93. What are error boundaries in React? The options are: Option A, components that catch JavaScript errors in their child component tree. Option B, a mechanism for handling HTTP errors. Option C, a way to define different UI for different user roles. Option D, a tool for logging errors to the console. The correct answer is option A, components that catch JavaScript errors in their child component tree. Moving on to the next question. Question 94. How do you define an error boundary? The options are: Option A, using a functional component. Option B, using a class component with component did catch or static get derived state from error. Option C, using a regular JavaScript function. Option D, using a hook. The correct answer is option B, using a class component with component did catch or static get derived state from error. Moving on to the next question. Question 95. What is the purpose of the component did mount lifecycle method in a class component? The options are: Option A, to update state. Option B, to fetch data or set up subscriptions after the component mounts. Option C, to clean up resources. Option D, to handle events. The correct answer is option B, to fetch data or set up subscriptions after the component mounts. Moving on to the next question. Question 96. What is the purpose of the component did update lifecycle method in a class component? The options are: Option A, to perform actions after the component updates. Option B, to fetch data before the component mounts. Option C, to clean up resources. Option D, to handle initial rendering. The correct answer is option A, to perform actions after the component updates. Moving on to the next question. Question 97. What is the purpose of the component will unmount lifecycle method in a class component? The options are: Option A, to perform actions before the component updates. Option B, to clean up resources before the component unmounts. Option C, to handle initial rendering. Option D, to fetch data. The correct answer is option B, to clean up resources before the component unmounts. Moving on to the next question. Question 98. Which hook is equivalent to component did mount and component did update combined, depending on dependencies? The options are: Option A, useState. Option B, useReducer. Option C, useEffect. Option D, useContext. The correct answer is option C, useEffect. Moving on to the next question. Question 99. Which hook is equivalent to component will unmount for cleanup? The options are: Option A, the function returned by useEffect. Option B, useLayoutEffect. Option C, useRef. Option D, useMemo. The correct answer is option A, the function returned by useEffect. Moving on to the next question. Question 100. What is the main advantage of using functional components with hooks over class components? The options are: Option A, better performance. Option B, easier to read and write, easier to test stateful logic. Option C, supports more features. Option D, required for all new React development. The correct answer is option B, easier to read and write, easier to test stateful logic. Congratulations on completing all 100 React Beginner MCQs. We hope this video has been a valuable resource in your learning journey. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your fellow aspiring developers, and subscribe to TutorialsArena for more insightful content. We'll be back next week with a fresh set of intermediate React interview questions to help you prepare for your next big opportunity.